All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. We're kind of a smaller group, so if anyone has any questions at any point, feel free to we can just do it throughout. Otherwise, there should be time at the end for some questions or comments as well. So we're gonna talk about salary transparency today and why it matters. I'm Hilary Stoss-Krause. I'm a VP at 10 Forward Consulting based in Madison, Wisconsin. This is my Halloween costume. My one is Scope Creep. Thank you. Spent way too much time hand markering that Scope logo and realized halfway through it was a terrible idea, but I was committed by then and I had no backups. All right, so we're gonna be talking about kind of 4 main components today. This is also where I like to say, if looking at this outline makes you realize this isn't what you thought it would be, feel free to go find a different session that might be more valuable for you. Totally good with that. We want everyone to make sure that they're learning something that they want to learn. So first, what is the big deal, right? Why are we having this conversation? Why do we even care about salary transparency? What are the different types of transparency? Because there's a lot of ways to approach this sort of area apart from the ones that immediately come to mind. Looking at 10 Forward as a case study, why did we implement salary transparency? What did we learn? What might we do differently? What do we still need to improve on, as it's an ongoing process? And then at the end, if there's time, like I said, I'd love to hear any questions or anyone else's experiences with salary transparency at their companies or questions about how to bring it to your company, things like that. So first, raise your hand if any of the following have applied to you. At one or more jobs, you didn't know what the salary would be until it was time to negotiate. Yeah, that's like everyone. At one or more jobs, you suspected you were underpaid compared to your coworkers. Almost everyone. At one or more jobs, you were discouraged from talking about compensation. Yeah. And at one or more jobs, you had some form of salary transparency. Lot fewer hands. So still some hands, which is good, but a lot fewer hands. So here's why that matters. 85 million is the projected global shortage of tech workers by 2030. And one thing I want to say is that I did actually today updated some of these slides because a lot of the information about current legislation for salary transparency is changing all the time. Some of the statistics that I'm citing, a lot of them I try to do global, some are US-based. Some of them are before kind of the sort of big tech company layoffs happened, so just take that going into some of these. But even with those layoffs, right, there's still plenty of people who cannot hire the tech folks that they need. 73% of US tech workers specifically are considering quitting in the next 12 months. 71% of IT workers globally don't have high intent to stay in their current role. You might be thinking, okay, well, if I don't run a business, if I'm not directly hiring people, why do I care? Why does this matter to me? It's extra work on your plate. Anyone who's worked at an understaffed company knows that that work still has to get done by someone, and it might end up being you. Company volatility. So if you're constantly hiring and having people leave and hiring and having people leave, it makes your job harder. It makes your, I was just at a session about communicating with technical and non-technical stakeholders, and talked about trust, right? And so it lowers your trust in your company, and that affects other part of your life. Unhappy coworkers, right? Nobody wants to be around an entire team that's thinking about quitting. That's a terrible position to be in. It's really bad for morale. And you might be unhappy. Maybe you're one of those people who's thought about quitting your job, feels like you're underpaid, who's wondering if everyone's being paid more than you, and that's just a really awful position to be in. So why have so many people been quitting? Low pay, lack of advancement opportunities, and feeling disrespected at work. Though these were the top reasons for Americans specifically that they quit their jobs. In Europe, they did a similar study, and they found that compensation was very high up there, but actually work-life balance for one of the first times had risen to be equal with compensation. So it's interesting to see too how parts of the world that have different work cultures, how this kind of changes. But for basically everyone, a big reason that you quit is because you're not getting paid enough or you think you're not getting paid enough. So what do employees want, right? Again, looking at that Pew study, they said that there are actually a lot of things, right? So in Europe, we said that, well, work-life balance is a big factor. In the States, 40% of recipients said that better childcare access would be really helpful, more flexibility, but that wasn't the main reason that they were quitting their jobs or thinking about quitting. The major concerns that they cited were, again, the pay, lack of advancement, and not feeling respected. And all of those are tied into different forms of salary transparency, as we're going to see as we go on. So, right, money, right? That's mostly the reason we have jobs. I mean, there are other things we like about our work, so it's fun, or we're contributing to our community, we have a sense of purpose, but at the end of the day, it's mostly because we have to eat and pay rent and feed our cats and buy more plants. It's not personal at all. So, salary transparency is another thing that's cited a lot that people want. So here are just a couple of different stats about that. 80% of people want some form of salary transparency. 68% would switch jobs for better pay visibility. 63% prefer to work at a company that has some kind of salary transparency. 82%, I love this one, 82% of people would be satisfied with lower pay if it was communicated clearly. 60% will quit because they think they're underpaid. And this is a key thing that we're going to talk about. They think they're underpaid. You might not be underpaid. You might be getting a market value. You might be getting the same pay as your coworkers. But if you don't have any kind of insight into that, especially if you're a woman, a person of color, non-traditional entry into tech, it's natural to kind of just assume we're probably being underpaid. And in a lot of cases, we are. And 70% believe that salary transparency is good for employee satisfaction. So there's a lot of data out there that says people want to have some kind of element of this in their professional setting. More than 80% of US employers who undertook pay equity audits found equity gaps in their organizations. 80%, and this is people who, for the most part, probably opted into these audits. Some of them, I'm sure, were forced because of really, really bad discrimination, but a lot of them opted in. So this is people who already, to a certain extent, care about this, and they're still having these huge gaps. So if we think about if we did the entire country or the world at large, like that number would be, that's just a lot of people who are not being paid what they should be. And of course, this wage gap globally is even worse for women, people of color. So again, this is kind of looking at the state specifically, but Latinas, Native Americans, and Black women working full-time lose about $1 million over the course of their working lives. And the statistic sounds like, oh, that's a lot of money, but it's like, how does that happen? And it's because a lot of issues with pay compound over time. So if you don't negotiate for your first job, you're gonna start out at a lower rate. And a lot of companies will ask, well, what did you get paid at your last job? You're gonna tell them. They're gonna continue that lower rate. And that just goes on and on and on throughout your job, throughout your career. And so by the end of it, those discrepancies in pay add up to being $1 million, which is just awful. So how does this happen? Right? There's a number of reasons. Something I hear about, I'm gonna have myself. So managers as advocates, right? In any kind of system where there is a lot of flexibility with compensation, often the type of manager that you have is gonna have a big impact on your compensation, right? So if you have someone who's really passionate and advocates for you and you get along well, you're probably gonna get paid more. If you have a manager who's kind of tuned out, or they're overworked, or they're underpaid, or you just don't really vibe personally, that can have a big impact on how much money you're making. Employees as advocates, right? Maybe you work at a company where you're expected to advocate for yourself. And that can be really challenging for a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. Relying on negotiation specifically is a primary tactic for increasing your compensation. This is also very problematic. You'll often hear people say, oh, well, if so-and-so is so unhappy with how much money they're making, why didn't they just negotiate better? Which is just the worst thing you could ever say, because you could have someone who is the best negotiator, who is saying the exact same things as someone else in the same tone, in the same way, has the same evidence. And again, there's all these other factors that play into whether or not that will work for them. So who are they trying to negotiate with? Are they a woman or person of color who's going to seem, like pushy? There's all this bias that comes into play that's really going to impact their ability to be successful in that negotiation. The time of year, right? Maybe 3 other people just got raises, and so even if you're negotiating really, really well, there's just not money, and the company's not going to give it to you, even though you did, everything right. So I really like the way that this frames it. Specifically the part here where I talked about this a little bit earlier, right? So salary expectations and anchor points in negotiations will be lower because of this pay gap issue. And then by not specifying a salary, companies use those lower expectations, the result of discrimination in prior jobs, to get away with offering lower salaries again and locking that pay gap in place. So that's how we get to that $1 million lost over time. This refers not to just listing salaries on job postings, but also asking about salary history, and we're going to talk about both of those in a little bit. So I really like this. One of the things that spurred this talk was that there has been a lot of legislation around the world that's really taking a look at salary transparency and trying to change regulations and expectations for companies. And so arguably, your company is going to have some legal obligations pretty soon if they don't already. But I'd argue, for all of these reasons we just looked at, that there's also a lot of ethical responsibilities here. And so I just really like this quote. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. So even if your company isn't swayed by the ethical arguments, the legal ones are going to catch up pretty soon, if they haven't already. So let's look at some of the different types of transparency. We're also going to look at who currently does legislate this, and maybe who's kind of coming up, and then what the impact is, if there's an impact that has been sort of tracked for that specific type of transparency. So the first big one is posting salaries with job listings. Seems pretty straightforward. And this one is gaining a lot of popularity even without it necessarily being legislated, because again, people are sort of demanding this when they're looking for jobs. So who already requires this? 17 US states require this. A bunch of them came on board last year and even some at the beginning of this year. Prince Edward Island, Canada, and there's a couple of other provinces that are looking at this as well. And then the EU, this is set to take place in the next 3 years. So you'll see the EU on pretty much every one of these slides. They have this Pay Transparency Directive. Has anyone been following that? No? Okay, cool. I can tell you about it. So it's this sweeping set of proposed regulations that actually just about a month ago, a large majority of European Union members approved. And it covers a ton of different aspects about wage transparency and compensation. And it's really, really cool. And I think it's one of those things that's, because so many of these countries are doing it and so many countries are multinational now, that it's going to be kind of like GDPR, right? Where it's going to kind of force other places to start doing a lot of these things as well. So very excited about that. They do have 3 years to implement these changes, but it's a good step in the first direction. One thing I also want to say is that there are sort of two different kinds of ways to provide transparency around wages with job listings. One, some legislation says anytime you post a job listing, including internal, so if there is a candidates are available for promotion, you have to post the job salary, the expected salary or range. Other legislation just says you have to make it available if someone asks, which I think is kind of shitty. Because again, we're putting the onus on the potential employee, and again, some people are going to be punished for being that direct, and so I think that's a flawed response, but better than nothing. So what is the impact of including salary ranges with job listings? You get up to 90% more applicants, which I think makes sense, right? Again, it's quickly becoming the norm, and so by not doing this, you're going to seem like an outlier in a very red flag kind of way. Indeed is a job matching site. 75% of their new job postings last year included the salary. LinkedIn, they saw a 35% increase in the first half of last year of job listings including salary information. Banning questions about pay history. So I had never really considered this before when I would think about what does it mean to have salary transparency. But this is really crucial for, again, not persisting those inequity gaps through a person's career. So who already requires this? 21 US states, actually, do not let you ask about a candidate's previous wage history. The EU, again, within the next 3 years. And that's kind of it, at least that I could find. And again, this is where I want to say that I spend hours and hours looking for information about this in countries around the world. But it's really hard to find, which I think is kind of ironic and also shows that it's probably not nearly widespread enough. There were some places, like especially looking for information about countries in Africa, the most I could find was that there's a big push for this in South Africa, but that was pretty much everything that came up when I would do searches, was just that people are asking for it, but it's not really there yet. So what's the impact of doing this? They did a study, and they had employers who had previous wage information for candidates and employers who didn't. And they looked to see who picked which candidate based on resume review and interviews with the information that they had. Compared with employers who had the wage information, those without it ended up interviewing and hiring workers who, on average, had made significantly less money in the past. And some of the reason for this is because, especially in capitalist countries, we see how much money you make as an indicator of how skilled you are, how successful you are. And so if you're coming in and you're like, oh yeah, I was a junior developer and I made 40 grand a year, people will be like, wow, you must have been a shitty developer, right? To only get paid that amount of money. Maybe, or maybe you were just really underpaid for a whole number of other reasons. And so this study showed that when you take away the wage history part of the equation, you're removing that whole set of bias, specifically that's around wage history, right? Obviously there's other biases that come into play, but you're eliminating this one big piece of it, and it showed that those people were hired closer to market rate and got a lot more offers because their past history, wage history, was not being used against them. The one downside to this is that it can make hiring take longer, right? Because you're removing this sort of easy, I would say lazy, data point that people can use when they're when they're evaluating candidates. Internal, external salary data. So this is kind of the big one we think about, right, when we think about salary transparency. So who already requires this? EU, within the next 3 years. Iceland, the UK, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, kind of. And I say kind of because in those countries, everyone's taxable income is available to find, but that could pull in income from a variety of sources, not just your job. So you can get a good sense, but you can't get exactly what someone's making necessarily. And then Japan. So one thing I want to say too, again, with this type of salary transparency, is that for a lot of these countries or regulations, it only applies to companies of a certain size. I think the Pay Transparency Directive for the EU, it was companies over 250 had to report every year, and companies with more than 100 employees had to report every 3 years, something like that. But it doesn't usually include every company. And so there's a ton of companies that can kind of slide under the radar of these regulations if they choose to. In the UK, for example, at least right now, the company has to have 250 employees or more to share the data. So again, lots of people who are going to kind of fall outside of this. And lots of countries also, if you're a federal worker, your pay is public. But again, that excludes tons of people who are not part of that. So there's definitely a lot of gaps in a lot of this regulation. Again, there's multiple types of access that people have to this information, even if it is accessible. So sometimes you can get it by person. You could get it by role, sometimes then also with a gender breakdown. Sometimes you just get averages at the company, and then again, sometimes it's published and available to find, and sometimes you have to request it. I think it was it Norway? One of those three, I was reading that you used to be able to just get any once. You could just make a request at the tax office and they would give it to you. And then they recently started requiring that when you made a request, they would share your name and address with the person whose information you were requesting. And requests dropped by 90%. So we want the tea, we just don't want people to know that we want the tea, which we're gonna talk about in a little bit. So what's the impact of sharing internal and external salary transparency or salary data in some form or another? Over 14 years for US academics, having that data easily accessible reduced the gender equity gap by up to 50%. That's among 100,000 academics. There's a 6% pay gap in Sweden, which again is one of those countries that publishes universal income tax returns, and they've been doing that for more than 100 years. In the US, the gender pay gap, as a comparison, in 2022 for the same job, same seniority, was 11%, so almost twice as high. This can lead to depressed wages and potentially decreased productivity, and I'm gonna kind of talk about those a little bit separately. So the depressed wages is because you often have, especially looking at equity gaps, right? There's a group of people who are underpaid and a group of people who are overpaid. And most companies are not gonna pull the underpaid all the way up to the overpaid, they're gonna meet somewhere in the middle. This also means that a lot of companies move to more of a metric-based system, and those metrics might not be accurate to what the job is, right? And people might work to the metrics, which is where the productivity can kind of come in line. On the other hand, if you're going to a role-based, you're just like, okay, well, you know, developer one is gonna make X amount of money, developer 2 makes X amount of money, developer 3 makes X amount of money, and that's just how we're doing it. So if you're in that developer 1 category, like you will never make more than X amount, even if you're amazing or terrible, you're gonna make about the same amount of money until you get to that next level. This is where they see a lot of that, where they have seen decreased productivity, because people kind of realize like, well, if I'm making the same amount of money, whether I'm working hard and doing well and taking on extra projects, or if I'm not, then why am I gonna put that extra work in? Which, fair play. So there's a lot of nuance to the impact of this, and a lot of it comes down to how are companies implementing it, and are they taking into account these kinds of complications that can have maybe unexpected consequences. Career progression, again, another one that I wouldn't really have connected with salary transparency, but it makes sense when we're thinking about salary in terms of over a career. So who already requires this? The EU, our good pals. Specifically, the regulation includes criteria that is, you have to publish criteria used to determine pay levels and career progression. So again, looking at like, what are the metrics that we're using to determine how much someone's gonna get paid? That's kind of it. It's the only one I could find. What's the impact? So 40% of IT software and tech workers said limited career progression made them think about quitting. 40% of Gen Z workers specifically said they'd accept a 5% pay cut for a job offering significant career growth opportunities. And so again, we see a lot of data that suggests that while compensation is very important, we care a lot as well about how that number, like where that number comes from. And so again, there was that other study earlier where people would be willing to accept lower pay if they knew the formula that led to that pay. And we saw this play out in 10Ford specifically. We had a junior developer, it was his first job in tech, but he had a lot of friends who worked in tech, and they worked for some of the bigger tech companies in the Madison area, so Google, Epic, Zendesk, you know. And he came in with a number that he thought was reasonable, and we had a salary range, you know, with the job listing. And we talked about it in our sort of pre-negotiation meeting, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And by the end, he was really happy to sign an offer letter that was quite a bit lower than what he originally wanted, because I could articulate very clearly, here's where we came for this number, here's what growth looks like at the company, this is kind of the next steps, this is how often people typically take before their first raise, you know. And it made sense to him, and it was done with respect, and it built that trust right away. And then 41% of workers in the US, Canada, UK, Australia, India, and Singapore said that lack of opportunity for upward mobility was the #1 reason why they quit. I mean, how many people here, just show of hands, how many of you know exactly what is expected of you to get to the next level in your company? There's like 4 hands raised. Right, which is terrible. And that's why people quit, right? I mean, it's like a joke that's not a joke in tech, right? If you want to raise, you got to go get a new job because you don't know how to get it at your own company. So diving quick to a case study of what we did at 10 Forward and kind of what I would share about our experience that might be helpful for others to know. So first, what were we already doing before we took on the sort of traditional salary transparency idea of sharing wages internally? We already had a published career progression document with salary ranges. And this is pretty specific. We came up with 6 core values: competency, like skills competency, learning and growth, teamwork. And then we had a description of what each of those meant. And then for each of the ranks at our company, which is named for the bar on the Enterprise from Star Trek, and so our ranks are all Star Trek ranks like ensign and lieutenant. But for each of those, we say, okay, so for this core value, here are examples of what that means. And here's the salary range for this role. Here is the flexibility for this role. This is the rough number of years people tend to have, but that's just a guide. And we did that for all of the ranks. So we already had that. We had documentation in our internal wiki on how to ask for a promotion or raise. We do quarterly reviews instead of annual reviews because who remembers what you did a year ago and why does that matter now? And so giving people more opportunities to be able to advocate for themselves or have their manager advocate for them at a more consistent cadence rather than just doing it once a year. And we felt pretty good about that, but there was more that we could do. And so one of the things that sparked additional efforts, it wasn't this exact tweet, and I spent way too much time, y'all, trying to find the original tweet. But it was a similar one, again, from another Black woman. And it was, reading this tweet, it was just something I hadn't really thought about before, right? And this was where it was kind of like a wake-up call for some of the privilege that I had. So she says, I always tell my clients to include the salary in a job description. It's an absolute privilege to be able to apply for a job without knowing the salary, a privilege that many Black and brown people don't have. And so I saw that and I was like, oh shit, that makes so much sense. So I immediately went up to our open positions and I added the salary range. We already had it, right? We knew what it was. It was in our career progression doc, so why weren't we sharing that? I also saw a great talk at Right to Speak Code in 2019 from Nancy Hawa. She's currently at Etsy. She talked about her company, which was Endeavor Results, instituted internal salary transparency, and the number of people whose wages went up as a result. And it was mostly women and people of color, as we might expect. So seeing that, I kind of thought like, oh, yeah, I mean, how hard could it be, right? We're already doing these other things. We're a small, close-knit team. We're built on progressive values. Everyone's gonna love this, right? Yeah, it was not that easy. The main thing was discomfort. And this is true across the board. So in most countries, but especially capitalist countries, talk about money just makes us uncomfortable. Our income is often tied to how we are valued in society. It also can play into other cultural values about, humility or being part of a collective instead of being an individual. And so there's a lot of different reasons why, but very broadly speaking, across the world, we have discomfort when it comes to talking about how much money we make. So, what was the problem? 65% of workers support sharing average salaries by pay and department. 75% oppose sharing individual salaries. So basically, we want to know what everyone else is making, and we don't want anyone to know what we're making. There's a couple ways to handle this, right? So you can do average salaries at a higher level, right? So again, kind of everyone at developer 2 makes this, or everyone with this many years of experience is gonna make around this, across the company. We're pretty small though. There's only like 12 of us, so that didn't seem like it would be very useful information. Like that wouldn't really help anyone if we just said, oh, our senior developers on average make X, Y, Z, because why, So we chose to do it sharing people's individual salary data. For us, this actually was welcomed by most employees. They were on board with it. They understood why we were doing it. It was in line with our values. Our team is primarily women, and at the time I think we were third women of color, and so everybody was like, yes, this is great, let's do it. The key exception was the lowest paid team member. And you might think, well, that makes sense. Of course, she would have the most discomfort with this kind of transparency. But what surprised me was the reason why. It wasn't because she felt that she was underpaid and had strong feelings about that. It was because she didn't want others to see her salary as the lowest paid person. She was in an administrative role. She didn't want others to see her salary and judge her for it and suddenly view her contributions or her skills as less than because they were connecting it to the amount of money that she was making. So in hindsight, what would we have done differently? Prep people more in advance and give them time to process. I think we had, I definitely spearheaded this, and I had this idea of like, oh, this is so great for all these obvious reasons. Let's just do it. And I think that I should have, knowing now what I know more about some of the nuance and some of the impact, answered some of those concerns preemptively and given people time to think about it and come to us with questions. Also, asking specifically for concerns instead of waiting for people to come to us, because especially around something like money, and especially if all of your coworkers seem really excited about it, it can be hard for you to be that one voice who's like, hey, actually, I have some concerns about this. So not just giving people a space to voice those concerns, but actively asking them what they were. And publishing documentation articulating not just how, but why. Because I think it was one of those things where having been to this talk, coming fresh off this conference, I was like, oh, this is great. There's so many reasons this is great, and you kind of forget what you know. And so I think doing a better job of communicating how we thought this would, like the value that we thought this would bring employees, not just the company. I think that kind of got lost in translation a little bit. And the big thing is just listening. Record keeping, this is another area that we had some issues with. Where does the data live? Right? Where are we going to put this on our internal wiki? Are we putting it in a spreadsheet somewhere? Are we putting it, who's going to update it? What information does it include? So we have a couple of negotiable benefits at our company, primarily vacation. And so it's like, okay, well, we can't just put salary because that doesn't paint the whole picture of someone's compensation package. And then we went, well, do we include, healthcare benefits or things like that, because not everyone picks that. And I was like, well, but we don't change compensation based on if you do or do not take healthcare. It's just an option you can pick, so we decided not to do that. But depending on how your company is structured, there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. So in hindsight, we needed a regular check-in to make sure it was up to date. I remember onboarding a new person and showing them the document, and then realizing that one of our senior developers had gotten a raise 6 months ago that was not reflected on there. And so we just put a check in that's like, hey, once a month, just make sure that you don't need to update any information. We added a historical data tab based on feedback, and this is something that I think was a really good idea that the team had, so that when we bring on a new person, especially if they're more early in their career, I can walk them through that and I can say, look, I started as an intern, 8 years ago, and now I'm a co-owner, and this is kind of the path that took me there. So this was how long it was between promotions, this was what the promotions were, this was how much more money I got at each promotion, and I could show, every team member that's currently at the company, you can see the progression of their career at the company. So that helps, again, with building trust, and also, I think with motivation, especially when you're earlier here, you're like, oh, I don't know anything, and it's like, well, look, you can see, average of about, 1.5 to 2 years before people got promoted. And again, that's just a guide, that's not a rule, but it gives you a better sense of how the company operates and kind of aligns your expectations. And then you can make that decision if maybe what you're seeing isn't what you want, and use that data to go find a job that is going to be a better fit for you. And then adding the range from our career progression doc for direct comparison, so that it's not just a list of numbers without any context, but adding that context so you can see oh, okay, yeah, so I see so-and-so is getting toward the top of the range for their level, or so-and-so is kind of at the bottom of their range, and there's a lot of room for them to grow yet within that from a salary standpoint. We did have some successes. So it's been cited as by applicants as something that encouraged them to apply or made them want to work here, one of those green flags, so that's been really cool. It's helped the team to advocate for themselves because, again, they have all that data in an easy-to-see format. So you can go ahead, you can, with one click, see when's the last time I got a raise and how much was it and where should it be according to the, career doc. And it's helped us advocate for team members too, because it's also one click for me to see, if I'm sitting there when we're getting up on quarterly reviews and I'm like, so-and-so has really been crushing it. Like, when's the last time we gave them a raise? And I can go find out immediately. Oh, yeah, it's been like a year and a half. Great, let's give them another raise. And then, like I said, builds trust from the get-go for new employees. So then going forward, since we implemented this about four years ago, we've developed what I call a pre-offer letter session. So I alluded to this earlier. When we have someone that we're like, okay, they've gone through our hiring process, we want to make them an offer, awesome. I sit down with them first, and we go through that career progression doc, and I say, based on everything in here, where would you put yourself? And I ask them to come prepared with 2 different numbers, well, technically 3, well, technically 4. So, so like I said, the main things that people negotiate for are vacation and base salary. So I say, I want to know your ideal number of vacation days and your ideal salary, and the lowest amount of vacation days you're happy with and the lowest salary you're happy with. And I stress to them, this is not the lowest you would accept. It's the lowest you'd be happy with. It's like, in a perfect world, we'll give you your ideal vacation and salary because we want you to feel valued and respected and heard right from the beginning. And again, because we're sharing job listings with the salary range, we don't get people to that stage who aren't aligned with where the salary is generally going to be. On the other hand, if you do have if we're just not aligned on where we think the salary should be, I want to know that immediately, right? So we're not wasting any more of your time. That hasn't actually happened, but in the case that it did, I just think it's good to get that out as soon as possible. So anyway, in the pre-offer letter session, I asked for these ones. And most of the time, we are able to get at or pretty close to their ideal. And in the situations where we can't, it allows me time to really think about, like, what are the metrics we're using? How are they playing it in this situation? And I can also say, as in the case in the junior I mentioned, I can say, like, here's exactly what I would want to see from you in your first 6 months, first year, to get you to that next level. And I can spell it out directly, and they can see the path forward. And so really the goal that we have is, like, to cut out the traditional sense of negotiating, because that just, it hinders employees more than anyone else, and it hinders a lot of employees a lot more than others. And give people offer letters that they're genuinely excited to sign. Like, if you're not excited on the first day, like, man, I don't know how, like, that just isn't setting it off on a good foot, And we might not be the best place for someone, and that's totally fine. But I think just setting those expectations, making sure everyone's on the same page, and having honest and thorough conversations about it is the best way to set people up to have a good working relationship where they feel valued and they're making the amount of money that they think is fair. We build in additional customization. So again, our vacation is customized. I was actually talking to a coworker of mine who's here, and she said when she first started, she was looking at the salary transparency doc, and there's another owner who we have similar roles, and she was like, wow, like, why is he making so much more money than Hillary? And it was because he has 2 weeks of vacation that we have to force him to use, and I have 5 weeks. And so our total compensation package came out to within like $500 of each other. But his base salary is a lot higher because he does not want to travel anywhere. We do still need to improve transparency around partner compensation. That has kind of shifted a lot over the last couple of years, and we've struggled to figure out the best way to convey that. And then we are also trying to figure out the best way to share information about referral bonuses and sales commissions, which tend to be more one-off. Really, the one-off commission pieces are really hard to track in a way that's useful for people. So that's where we're still trying to figure that out. If anyone has ideas on that, I would love to hear it. And that's what I've got. So thanks for your time. And then I have a bunch of citations as well that'll be in the slides, so if anyone wants to follow up with some of the stuff I said. So I think we do have a little bit of time, which is a miracle. So Anyone have any questions or observations or anything they want to share? Yeah. Yeah, the question was, does it seem like it's mostly coming from the top, or is it coming more from employees who are doing the advocating? I would guess employees, because there are unethical incentives for managers to not want this. If you're looking at it, I would argue short-sightedly, because again, implementing salary transparency can expose gaps that you want filled for the long-term health of your organization. So example, are we measuring the right metrics when we're looking at performance-based compensation? Are we attracting the best people, or are there people who just aren't even applying because we're not sharing enough of this data? That being said, I think it'd be really hard to, depending where you live, it would be hard to get a lot of momentum without some buy-in from leadership. And so people have tried this. So in the States, which surprised me that not everybody knew this, but in the States specifically, you are, with a few rare exceptions, you are legally protected to share your salary information with your coworkers, and you cannot be penalized for that. And yet, so few people do. And sometimes when people have, so a great example is at Google, Erica, I'm blanking on her last name. Oh my God. There was a woman who started an internal spreadsheet for salary data. She was having wine with some of her coworkers one night, and somehow salary came up and they started talking about it, and they all made really disparate amounts of money. And she was like, I wonder if this is an issue in our department or if this is like a company-wide problem. And this was a long time ago. And that led to, like, she ended up basically being, she wasn't fired, but she was pushed out of her job for creating this spreadsheet that went viral within the company. So even though it was perfectly legal, there can still be repercussions. And so that's why I say that, you know, there, depending again where you live and what your local laws are, there's a lot you can do on your own, but it depends on the power you have at the company and what kind of repercussions you might face if you don't have buy-in from higher up. Yeah, I think, so the question was the employee we had who was the lowest paid at the time that we moved to transparency, and her concerns, how do we kind of work with her to make her feel more comfortable? I think the first thing was establishing, like, I know you're saying you're good with your salary, but are you actually good with your salary, right? And really trying to get to the bottom of that. And then once we ascertained that yes, no, she was good with that, it was just kind of, again, working through that career progression doc and being like, okay, well, you know, this is what your career could look like. We want to help you get to the next level. We want to do this and that. And then a lot of it was just saying, you know, kind of telling her things she already knew, but just needed to hear, which was that, you know, we value you as a person beyond just your contributions to the workplace. You know, you are not your salary, like we talk a lot at 10 Forward about. You know, we are not our code, we are not our designs, we are not our whatever. And it's like, you know, you are not the work that you do, that is just your job. But it's tricky because a lot of that has a lot of layers. And this was someone who also came from a lower income background. And so there's just a lot that kind of ties into that. So it's really hard. I think just being open, having the conversations and making her feel heard was really the biggest thing we could have done. Mm-hmm. Oh, advice for advocating where there isn't support. I think the big thing, and this is true for kind of any change you're trying to make at your company, is the more people you have on board when you bring up the idea, the much more likely it is to move forward. And so just talking to your coworkers and being like, hey, do you wish that you knew more about how much we get paid? Or like, do you think you might be underpaid? I think I might be underpaid. Just kind of getting those conversations started more one-to-one. And then once you kind of have a bit of critical mass, you can move it forward. You know, if you don't have that, if you have an HR department at your company that's actually like legit, that's another great avenue, right? Because especially as there's more of these legal obligations, they're probably starting to think about this anyway. And so I think a great way to frame it is like, hey, I just saw that, you know, neighboring country did this thing, or I see that, like if you're in one of the EU countries, like, oh, I see that we're gonna have to start doing this stuff in a while. Like, I'm super excited about this. What can I do to help? Or like, what are your thoughts on it? Really coming at it from a place of, I think framing can be important, again, depending on who you're talking to and what power and what relationship you have with them. Because I think a lot of companies think like with unionizing, right? Where they're like, oh, if you want to unionize, you must be really unhappy here, or you must want way more money, right? And it's like, oh, if you want salary transparency, you must think you're all really underpaid. And it's like, even if you do, maybe don't say that, right? And so framing it as like, yeah, I think this is so cool, and I know that our company really wants to be equitable, and we value inclusion, and this is a great way to do that. That framing can really go a long way with getting some of the higher ups on board. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, what if your company has full-time staff and then also contractors? How do you handle that? And I think it can get tricky. I think if I were going to do that, I think the best way to do it is to, again, give the full context. So contractors typically make more per hour, depending, where you're sourcing them from, because they're paying their own taxes, they're paying their own healthcare, so just making it clear, so maybe in that case, I would put information about, well, what are the benefits that our full-time employees are taking advantage of, and what is the company cost for that, to give more context to why the contractor rate might be higher. I know that is one of the exceptions to the US law, is, for example, there are certain contract workers who their salary is considered like, what's the expression? It's like company like there's intellectual property or something. I had a friend who does contract work for data for like pharmaceutical companies, and she's not allowed to talk about she somehow fits one of those exceptions in the US law about sharing her salary. But so there might be some things you might run up with that with contractors where it's handled differently. I'd also be curious if the legislation looks at full-time versus contractor different, because one of the things that we've seen is a lot of the legislation, of course, employers are trying to get around it, right? So it's like, oh, you have to post a salary range with your jobs. Great, $0 to $100,000. It's like, that's not what we meant. And so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this legislation only targeted full-time employees, and if some of that might result in companies doing more contracting to avoid the reporting and audit laws. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, so that's interesting. So she was saying in Australia, every company over 100 has to report their salary data to the government, but employees can't share with each other. Is that correct? Yeah, it's also interesting, and the laws are also different, and they seem contradictory in a lot of ways. I think one of the biggest things is that, and I think this is in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, that companies over a certain size have to do their own audits every so often. And I believe it was if there's more than a 5% equity gap in pay, then there's some kind of, I don't know if it was a fine or some kind of inspection they have to go through or something, but that's really what you need. Because just getting the data by itself doesn't necessarily paint a clear picture. Especially if you're at a large company and they're just doing averages and there's no breakdown by experience or education or race or gender, that it doesn't really tell you if you're getting paid enough. So I think the key thing here is looking at it from an equity standpoint, not just having the hard data. But that's really a bummer that y'all, well, and maybe that's not surprising that I was reading, I didn't put this in the talk, but they looked at which countries, so it was a 71% of people globally, IT workers, don't have a high intent of staying in their current role. And Australia had the highest amount of people polled who I think it was closer to 83% of people, IT workers, don't have high intent to stay in their current role. And so I wonder if there's some relation to that, right? Because if you think you're getting underpaid, just go find a new job. So, yeah. Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.